Oh, whatever you want. I mean, spring and summer are great. Fall is great. You know, the animals are active in the cool weather, so May is a great time. If you can ever come up on a weekday, you know, I'll certainly love to host you. Saturdays are great. Saturdays. We'll do it. And friends, family, or friends. Okay. Give me whatever heads up you have, and we'll make it work. Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Explorers Club. My name is Jim Knox. I'm honored to be a member here at the club, and let's just say that it's an extraordinary place. By raise of hands, who's been here before? Awesome, love it. And who's here for the first time? Equally impressive. Okay, so the club is famously known for exploration, research, conservation, among other endeavors. What it is not as famously known for, what it is so significant, at least in my mind for, is that it is a meeting place, a place of sharing and caring. So before you leave tonight, talk to that person on your left, talk to that person on your right, and learn and grow together. It's an extraordinary experience. Well, speaking of extraordinary experiences, the Monday Night Lecture Series has been going strong since the 1920s, highlighting new developments in field research and exploration. Tonight, we are thrilled to host Leigh West, an Explorers Club grantee and field ecologist. Leigh is a field researcher and PhD candidate in the Abrams Lab at the University of Washington's Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. She is also an affiliate researcher with Wild and Trust. Her research explores how large carnivores adapt to environmental extremes with a focus on drought. Supported by an Explorers Club expedition grant, her PhD focuses on how predators move, interact with one another, and navigate living alongside people in resource-scarce landscapes. With extensive field research across 4 continents, Leigh has studied everything from marine invertebrates and seabirds in Antarctica, to primates and predators in Africa, to cetaceans in New York City's urban waters, and we'll have to ask you about that later. She holds a BA in environmental biology from Columbia University and a master's in science communication from Imperial College London, where she wrote her dissertation on the portrayal of traditional ecological knowledge in the television program The Wild Thornberrys. When not in the field, Leigh enjoys cooking, live music, and hiking with her dogs. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Leigh West.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm excited to share with you how climate change is affecting some of the world's most iconic predators in Botswana's Okavango Delta, and how this is changing the way they interact with humans. There we go. But this isn't just about one place or one species. Climate change is impacting wildlife across the globe. From polar bears struggling with melting ice to elephants in Africa facing new challenges, the changing climate is reshaping ecosystems and forcing species to adapt in ways we've never seen before. It's widely accepted that extreme climate events like heat waves, wildfires, and droughts can directly impact the survival and health of species. But climate change doesn't just affect wildlife in these kind of more obvious ways. It also has indirect effects that ripple through entire ecosystems. For example, shifts in rainfall and plant growth can alter prey availability, which in turn affects the behavior and survival of top predators. This focus on how environmental change impacts wildlife has been a thread running through much of my own research. We've already kind of gotten a taste of this from that lovely introduction, but I'll talk a bit about my background here. So I first completed ecological research as an undergraduate, where I studied predator-prey dynamics between leopards and baboons in South Africa's Soutpansberg Mountains. Between finishing university, sneak peek. Between finishing university and starting graduate school, I completed fieldwork in a wide variety of systems, like studying pumas in the Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as the Bay Area in California. And then for 6 years, in my late teens to my mid-20s, I worked on a long-term research project in Antarctica, studying how climate change was impacting the marine food web. I completed 5 field seasons there, spending a total of just over 2 years at a US Antarctic research base called Palmer Station. During the pandemic, I completed a master's in science communication in the UK. And then about 3.5 years ago, I began my current position working with Brianna Abrams at the University of Washington, which is where I'm completing the work that I'll talk about today. So as I've mentioned, my doctoral research takes place in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. And you can see the rough location of our study site, called Wild Dog Research Camp, marked by that red pin. And to help you understand the inspiration behind my PhD project, let me share a story from one of my first nights at this field camp in Botswana. Imagine sitting at a dining table in an open-air kitchen in the middle of the Botswana wilderness. The floodplain stretches out in front of you, and between your tent and the kitchen sits a small bird bath, just about 30 feet away from the dining room table. You see a lioness slink into view, locking eyes with you as she slowly lowers her head to drink. John, a local collaborator, was sitting at the table next to me. I asked him if this happened often, and he explained how dry of a year it had been. There's no water anywhere else, he said. All of the natural water holes have dried up. This group of lionesses have very young cubs that aren't mobile yet, so every few days they'll travel down to our camp to drink before returning to their cubs. As someone interested in how climate change affects carnivores, I found this moment deeply compelling. I had always understood that large carnivores usually get most of their water from the prey that they eat, and that during droughts, changes in their movement were mostly driven by shifts in prey availability. But this lioness, and what John described, suggested something different. Maybe water itself, not just prey, could be a key driver of movement during dry periods. That idea got me thinking more broadly about the different ways drought might shape carnivore behavior. Was it just water scarcity? Or was it also about prey becoming harder to find, or human activity changing as conditions worsened? What about the movements of other carnivores? Were they influencing each other in different ways as they competed for these limited resources? These questions became the foundation of my dissertation. To attempt to answer these questions, let's journey into the heart of the Delta, an incredibly biodiverse ecosystem and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an incredibly dynamic place, which, due to seasonal flooding, changes every 6 months from an incredibly lush, wet, green ecosystem to a very arid landscape. And in addition to these seasonal changes, the area is experiencing increasingly frequent and severe drought events, transforming the landscape into something like this. And these drastic shifts in precipitation can impact animals in many ways, from direct impacts of water available for drinking, to shifts in prey availability, to changes in apex predator behavior and human-wildlife interactions. These dynamics are especially important to understand in regions like Botswana, which, like many parts of the world, is experiencing rapid and unprecedented change due to climate change. In recent years, the country has faced severe droughts and record-breaking temperatures. Here, you can see how these extreme climate events not only affect the ecosystems and species of the Delta, a globally important biodiversity hotspot, but also have serious consequences for people in Botswana, many of whom depend directly on water for their livelihoods. Importantly, drought just doesn't affect humans and wildlife separately, it affects how they interact. This excerpt from a 2019 drought vulnerability assessment shows that during a particularly severe drought year, Botswana recorded its highest levels of human-wildlife conflict to date. Large carnivores are especially vulnerable to both climate stressors and human-wildlife conflict, which makes them a useful focal group for understanding these challenges. This slide shows a small sample of the world's largest carnivore species, along with their IUCN status and population trends. For context, about 20% of all vertebrate species are listed as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. But for large carnivores, the picture is more concerning. 61% of species are considered threatened, and 77% of their populations are in decline. While it's widely believed that climate change will have significant impacts on large carnivores, we still have a lot to learn about exactly how. We don't yet fully understand the pathways through which environmental extremes shape carnivore behavior, or what those behavioral changes might mean for their long-term survival. And that brings us to the journey we'll be taking in today's talk. We'll head to my field site in Botswana, where we track Africa's top carnivores to understand how environmental changes are reshaping their behavior, as well as the delicate relationships between people and wildlife. Along the way, we'll explore how tools like GPS technology, ecological modeling, and field-based observation help us uncover hidden patterns in predator movement. And we'll close by connecting these findings to broader conservation challenges, asking how we can protect both carnivores and the communities living alongside them in a changing climate. Excuse me. Before we dive into how we study these animals, I want to introduce you to our cast of characters, some of Africa's top carnivores, and the focus of my research. This particular region of Botswana, the Okavango Delta, provides critical habitat for all 5 of these species: lions, hyenas, leopards, African wild dogs, and cheetahs. Over more than a decade, we've been able to collect GPS tracking data on 4 of these species, capturing how their movements respond to different environmental conditions, including multiple droughts. These species play important roles in their ecosystems, helping to regulate prey populations and maintain balance. But they're not just important individually, they're also part of a complex community, with each species interacting with each other in different ways. For example, lions, up top, are the dominant carnivores in this system. Their size and social structure allow them to monopolize key areas, like waterholes and areas with lots of prey. Smaller predators, like cheetahs and African wild dogs, often avoid these areas to reduce the risk of conflict with lions. So where these smaller species go isn't just shaped by prey or water, not just by resources, it's also shaped by where the lions are. This layered dynamic makes the Okavango Delta an ideal place to ask, how do environmental changes like drought shift these relationships? And to answer that, we need to know not just where these animals are, but how their behaviors change as environmental conditions change. And to really understand these changes, we need to know what these animals actually do on the landscape. Well, that's easier said than done. We do a lot of direct observations in the field from manual Land Rovers like this one. Which allows us to collect super detailed records of carnivore behavior while we're with them, like what habitats they're moving through, like this lion, male lion here, and their behaviors, like when they're resting or moving, and what individuals they're interacting with. But predators like lions, leopards, and wild dogs are cryptic, wide-ranging, and many of them are mostly active at night. They also move through really challenging habitats, like deep water. You can see us driving through the delta here in the trusty Land Rover, and cold weather. And thick vegetation. So for a carnivore moving through these landscapes, it's easy. They can just kind of weave through and be on their way. But if we're trying to stay with them, to have eyes on them and record their behaviors, it becomes a lot harder. And in addition to these challenges, following them around all the time takes a pretty heavy toll on our field vehicles, with situations like these being very common. And here I'm hours away from our research camp a lot of the time in these vehicles, often on my own, and sometimes end up sending satellite messages back to our mechanic saying things like, "Hi, I think my car battery died. Went to start car, when pressed ignition button, nothing happens. No sound, radio dead, surrounded by 5 lions." So how do we know what our study species are doing when we're not with them? Because clearly we can't be with them all the time. This is where biologging comes in. Biologging is the use of small devices attached to animals that record data about their movements, behaviors, and even their environments. In my work, I use GPS collars, a type of biologging device that lets us track where predators like lions and wild dogs go, how far they travel, and when they visit certain places. And I have a little show and tell element. We can pass this collar around. It is, full disclaimer, not from the species I study, but from a mountain lion. And these collars collect data multiple times a day, for months or even years, without us needing to be anywhere nearby. They're one of the most powerful tools we have to study animals that are elusive, wide-ranging, and hard to observe directly. Collaring a predator in the Okavango Delta takes careful planning, a lot of patience, and sometimes a bit of luck, but the payoff is a remarkable window into their hidden world. But biologging isn't just for carnivores. This technology is being used all across the animal kingdom. Thanks to advances in satellite technology and miniaturization, researchers can now track tiny animals like honeybees, helping us learn how they pollinate crops and support healthy ecosystems. Just like our computers, as our technology improves, our tracking devices are smaller and smaller, and the number of species and taxa that we are able to track is growing exponentially. And at the other end of the spectrum, satellite tags can also be used to study the largest animal to ever live on Earth, the blue whale, which can grow to be the size of 3 bus lengths and have tongues that weigh as much as an elephant and hearts the size of a car. And if you look really carefully, you might be able to see a satellite tag right there. But regardless of the size of the animal in question, the way the technology works is the same. Say we want a whale to be collecting data for us as it moves through its ocean environment. We put a satellite tag on it, which then communicates with more satellites in the Earth's orbit, and then transmits information on that animal's position to us at various intervals in time. And what we end up with is something like this, which is an animation of satellite tracking data collected from blue whales that my colleagues have used to examine whale interactions with shipping vessels. Another one of my favorite examples is this. We didn't really know where female northern elephant seals went after breeding. Then researchers started tagging them, and we were shocked to learn that they migrate thousands of miles into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. These tags revealed incredible journeys, seals diving thousands of feet deep, spending months feeding in ocean areas that we previously knew almost nothing about. So biologging doesn't just teach us about an animal's behavior, it also reveals information about their environment that we'd otherwise never see. This powerful technology even lets us experience the world from an animal's perspective. This footage comes from a camera tag placed on an eagle. It gives us a literal bird's eye view, soaring over mountains and navigating landscapes we'd struggle to reach ourselves. And beyond being beautiful, these perspectives are scientifically powerful. They help us understand not just where animals go, but how they move through challenging environments. And just like we saw with the eagle and whale, biologging gives us a way to uncover hidden movement patterns. So now let's bring it back to my project to see how we leverage this technology. In collaboration with Botswana Predator Conservation, we've been using GPS collars to track carnivores across the Okavango Delta for over a decade. So far, we've collared dozens of individuals, including 30 African wild dogs, 5 cheetahs, 8 leopards, and 14 lions. And we've collected nearly 150,000, yeah, that's the right number, GPS location. What you're seeing here is a snapshot of these movements across the landscape. Each point represents a moment in time, where that animal was, what it might have been doing, and what it might have encountered. And now that we've explored how biologging works across species, we're going to focus on what we can learn from these data. How do these predators move during drought, and what does that mean? Not just for the predators, but for the people living alongside them. So from these collars, we get a wealth of information about the behaviors of these carnivores. We can tell when and where they move, and we're even starting to be able to disentangle their fine-scale behaviors, like how fast they're running. So you can see in this plot on the top right here, those are the GPS locations, so where the animals are in space. And these are African wild dogs that you can see in some of the animations clearly that they move together as a pack. And then in this bottom graph, all these squiggly lines are indicating how fast they're moving. And I have a colleague that built this little prototype that we attached to the collars it's like a Fitbit for wildlife. It kind of tells you the direction of movement, the speed of movement. Also has a microphone on it to record the sounds that they're making, which can help us figure out if they're feeding or drinking. So yeah, really powerful technology. So we can tell if they're being vigilant or looking around their environment, like this lion resting here is. And possibly also social behaviors like this. Or this. So how am I leveraging this GPS tracking technology to answer my research question? Well, the first chapter of my PhD was focused on these first 3 pieces of the puzzle. How does drought impact predator movement, and how does it influence their interactions with other carnivores? And one of the main ways to describe animal movement is through the concept of a home range. So a home range is the area that an animal regularly uses to meet its basic needs. So finding food, water, shelter, and raising young. To put it in human terms, imagine drawing a circle on a map around your home, your workplace, your favorite coffee shop, your grocery store, and maybe your best friend's house. That cluster of places you move through in your daily life, that's kind of like your home range. For carnivores, understanding how this space changes, especially during environmental stressors like drought, is key to understanding how they're responding to climate change. So in this image of a wild dog home range on the right, each dot is a wild dog GPS location, and that larger polygon is their home range. And these data allow us to ask, what happens to this space when conditions change? So now that we've laid that foundation, the first key question I asked was, does drought change how much space carnivores use? And we had two different predictions for how this could play out. Because when resources are abundant, carnivores likely don't have to search very far to locate them, which would result in smaller home ranges. But during drought, resources like water and prey are harder to find, so carnivores have to move more to locate what they need, which would look something like this and result in larger home ranges. On the flip side, if a carnivore finds itself near a particularly reliable patch of resources, like a water hole, it might just stick close to that area, which in that case, we'd actually expect to see smaller home ranges during drought. So we have these two competing ideas. Carnivores might expand their home ranges during drought to search for resources, or they might contract their ranges if they're anchored near a reliable water or food source. So what did we actually find? Here we're going to look at wild dog home range size in relation to drought. So on the there's only like 3 graphs in here, I promise. So on the x-axis, we have drought conditions moving from wetter years on the right to drier years on the left. And the y-axis shows home range size. And what we see is that wild dog home ranges get larger during drought. So they're traveling further, likely in search of increasingly scarce food and water. And we can visualize this in this map to the right. So the top map shows home ranges during wet conditions, and the bottom map shows those same individuals during drought, and you can see how much they've expanded. And we see the same response for lions as well, which is again illustrated by these home range maps on the right, with the home ranges in dry conditions on the bottom being larger than the wet conditions up top, and for leopards too. So now that we've seen how drought changes the amount of space each species of carnivore uses, but carnivores don't move through the landscape in isolation. They share space with each other. And that brings us to the second part of our question: how does drought impact the way predators interact with one another? And to explore that, we looked at spatial overlap, which is just a way of measuring how much space two individuals or a species are using in common. So the area where these two home range polygons intersect is the spatial overlap between these two individuals. And when predators are using the same areas at the same time, there's more potential for competition, conflict, or avoidance behaviors, especially when resources are scarce. So understanding how this spatial overlap changes during drought can give us insight into how relationships between predators shift under environmental pressure. So again, we had two competing predictions for how this might play out. The first is that when resources like water or prey become scarce, dominant predators like lions might more aggressively defend those limited resources. And in response, smaller or subordinate species like wild dogs might avoid those areas. So if this pattern holds, we'd expect to see less spatial overlap between species during drought. But there's another possibility. Subordinate species might not have the luxury of staying away from these key resources. If drought makes resources hard to find, these species might start taking more risks, using areas they might normally avoid, like those of high lion presence, even if that means getting closer to dominant predators. So in this scenario, we'd see more spatial overlap during drought. So back to our fun little animations. That would look something like this. In this case, the lion is protecting these limited resources during drought. The wild dog is excluded and needs to seek these resources elsewhere, which leads to a decrease in spatial overlap. And in our alternative prediction, where resource scarcity during drought causes subordinate species to use riskier areas in order to access limited water and prey, it would look like this, with the result being an increase in overlap between species during drought. So which prediction was true? I'll save you guys the graphs this time and just show a couple maps. When looking at leopards and lions, we saw that spatial overlap increases during drought. And you can see that depicted for a couple of individuals here, with leopards in red and lions in gold. And you can see that the amount of overlap between the two species increases in the drought plot on the bottom. And we also saw this for the cheetah-lion pair, with overlap between cheetahs and lions also increasing during drought conditions. So let's zoom out and recap what we found. During drought, carnivores expanded their home ranges, likely a response to having to search farther for water and food. These larger ranges might come with a cost. It might mean more energy spent, which could affect things like reproduction or survival for these animals over time. We also saw increased overlap between species during drought, especially between dominant and subordinate predators like lions and cheetahs. And this suggests that in dry times, some species may be taking more risks. And all of this matters because droughts aren't rare events anymore in southern Africa. They're becoming more frequent and more intense. So these kinds of behavioral shifts, more movement, more overlap, more competition, more risk, could have lasting implications for how predator communities function and how they interact with people living alongside them. These ripple effects are exactly where the next part of my PhD picks up. While the first chapter of my dissertation focused on how drought affects carnivore behavior and interactions with other predators, my second and third chapters explore what these environmental extremes mean for human-wildlife conflict. So on this map, you can see the same GPS locations from lions, leopards, wild dogs, and cheetahs that we looked at earlier, but now we've added the locations of some of the human villages in our study system, those black dots, which highlight where people and predators are sharing space. So next, we'll take a closer look at how the consequences of environmental extremes like drought play out in these shared landscapes. But first, let's take a moment to unpack what we actually mean when we talk about human-wildlife conflict. So we define human-wildlife conflict as direct interactions between people or human property and wildlife with negative outcomes. It costs the global economy billions each year, and it can threaten human lives, livelihoods, and biodiversity. And here are just a few examples of how human-wildlife conflict can show up on the ground. These help give a sense of the range and scale of the issue and how deeply it can affect both people and wildlife. So wildlife damage to only 4 crops, corn, cotton, soybeans, and wheat, resulted in losses of almost $600 million in 2017 alone. Economic losses associated with livestock predation by wild carnivores in South Africa in 2010 totaled $171 million. Damages from vehicle collisions with wildlife, primarily deer, in North America exceed $1 billion annually. And unintentional and intentional killing of wildlife contributes to the global endangerment of many species, particularly mammals. Oops. A couple of years ago, our research group published this review paper exploring the growing connection between climate change and human-wildlife conflict. What we found is that climate change, whether through long-term warming trends, more variable weather, or extreme events like droughts and floods, can increase the likelihood of negative interactions between people and wildlife. And what immediately is apparent when we did this study was that the number of studies documenting climate-driven conflicts has really skyrocketed. The first case we found didn't appear until 1994, so it's only quite recently that this phenomenon has been identified. We also see a huge increase in studies in just the last few years, with greater appreciation for both the role of acute events in dark purple, so things like droughts, and of long-term climate changes, so more like long-term warming in pink, driving increased conflicts. And when we look at this global map showing changes in how much space people and wildlife share, we can begin to understand why this might be happening. As climate conditions shift, both people and animals are being pushed into closer proximity, often competing for increasingly scarce resources like water, grazing land, or food. And this pattern isn't just being noticed by scientists. Just in the last few years, media reports have been increasingly cropping up that start to tell a story about how climate conditions can play a central role in human-wildlife interactions. And I'll read you a few example headlines. Mobs of kangaroos take to streets of Australia's capital over food shortages. Lakes' rising waters bring crocodiles and hippos closer to residents, threatening life, limb, and livelihoods. When we plant, they come. Thirsty elephants pose new problem for drought-hit Kenyan farmers. And a little closer to home, could Hurricane Ian increase the chances of alligator attacks in South Carolina? What to know? For large carnivores, this is especially important. Apex predators are known to be sensitive to the effects of climate extremes like drought, and research has shown that livestock predation tends to increase during droughts as natural prey become harder to find. That in turn heightens conflict with people who may lose valuable livestock. Unfortunately, this often results in lethal retaliation, contributing to the global decline of large carnivores. And understanding these patterns is key to developing strategies that reduce conflict and support coexistence, especially as climate change continues to reshape the landscapes these species rely on. Given everything we've just seen, the growing body of evidence linking climate change to human-wildlife conflict, and the known impacts of drought on predator behavior, I wanted to understand, how does drought affect interactions between predators and people? My prediction was that during droughts, when natural water sources and prey became scarce, carnivores may be more likely to venture into areas where people live, drawn by alternative resources like livestock or human-provided water sources. This kind of behavior shift could have serious consequences on both sides, leading to population declines for carnivores, as we discussed. And for people, it might mean losing livestock, which can be economically devastating, especially in rural areas where livestock are a primary source of income. Anecdotally, we have seen that this is true for local communities around our field site. This is the quote from the aunt of one of our local research collaborators sharing her experience during droughts. She says, "The drought was painful and tough. We saw predators regularly. They came closer because they knew the livestock were weak. Our livestock were hit from both sides because they had to travel further to find water and grazing areas. So they were more exposed to predators. And also, predators came into the livestock pens more. There was so much predation." Here we see that the pathways leading to human-wildlife conflict during drought are complicated. Is it that people are moving closer to wildlife areas, or are wildlife moving closer to human areas, or both? So in this final part of the talk, I'll walk through how I investigated this using GPS data to track carnivore visits to human settlements across different climate conditions. This part of my research is still in progress, so what I'll share here are some very preliminary findings. This map shows our study area in northern Botswana. The brown pin marks the nearest city, Maun, and the green pin shows the approximate location of our, there's no pins, of our field camp, about a 3-hour drive from Maun. The blue dots represent human settlements in the region, and this black line is important. It marks a veterinary fence that separates the livestock rearing area to the south from the photographic tourism zone to the north. And all of these red and orange dots that you see represented are confirmed carnivore visits to settlements. So based on the GPS data, we know that these individuals entered areas where people live. Using these data, we looked at whether African wild dogs, lions, and leopards, we didn't include cheetahs here because we didn't have enough data from them, were more likely to visit settlements during drought, and if so, what might be drawing them in. What we found so far has actually been a bit surprising. Based on conversations with local community members and based on findings from a few other studies on lion conflict during drought in different regions, we expected that lion visits to settlements would increase during drought as they search for livestock or water. But that's not what we're seeing in our data. Instead, lion visits to settlements appear to decrease during drought, while wild dog visits increase. And one possible explanation for this pattern in wild dogs is linked to the social dynamics between species that we discussed earlier. So lions are dominant in this system, and similar to what we saw with the home range expansion hypotheses, they might be able to protect shrinking natural water sources or shrinking prey areas during drought, where in contrast, wild dogs might be displaced and pushed elsewhere to search for alternative resources like those found in or near human settlements. And that seems to be supported by our data. During drought, wild dog visits to settlements are more likely when there's a human-made water hole nearby or when there's livestock present. The drop in lion visits is harder to explain, so we're still digging into this, and hopefully soon we'll better understand what's really driving these patterns. The last piece of my research that I'll show you is even more preliminary, so I want to emphasize that it's more exploratory, but I think it offers some important context to end on. For the final chapter of my PhD, I'm shifting from using carnivore GPS movement data to looking at records of actual human-carnivore conflict incidents reported by local people. In Botswana, when wildlife causes harm, like killing livestock or damaging property, people can report it to the government and apply for compensation. Through a collaboration with the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks, we obtained records of these reported conflict events from 2015 to present. And what you're seeing here is the raw data. And right away, something stands out, which is that this most recent year of 2023 to 2024 shows a surge in reported conflicts. And I want to be clear that we can't really say yet what's driving this spike. There could be a lot of contributing factors, but one thing that's worth noting is that 2023 was one of the driest years in Botswana in the past 3 decades, so since 1994, I think. So definitely something interesting to explore. So where does this leave us? Across all of my chapters of this research, of my dissertation, we've seen that climate extremes like drought can reshape carnivore behavior, alter how species interact, and sometimes push predators into human spaces, raising the risk of conflict. And we know that the interplay between climate and human-wildlife conflict adds pressure to already vulnerable species and already vulnerable human communities. That's the bad news. But the good news is that understanding these patterns empowers us to plan smarter and act earlier to ensure that people and wildlife can share these landscapes into the future. So how does this work help us to better conserve wildlife? It tells us that we need to protect larger landscapes and maintain movement corridors to accommodate shifting space needs of carnivores during drought. We need to support communities with better livestock management and compensation programs and proactively prepare people for spikes in conflict during extreme climate events like drought. We need to adapt conservation policies to be climate aware, making them responsive to both long-term trends and short-term climate extremes. We need to design coexistence strategies that are creative, flexible, and locally grounded, because people and wildlife can't really be managed in isolation anymore. And ultimately, that is what this work is about, is finding ways to build a future where both people and wildlife can thrive, even in the face of a changing climate. To end, I want to thank my co-authors and all of the others who have supported this work, in particular our partner in the field, Botswana Predator Conservation, and my advisor, Brianna Abrams. It's taken the hard work and dedication of a big group of people over many years to compile the kind of data set we need to examine these kinds of questions of climate impacts on wildlife, and I'm just one small piece of this very large puzzle. If you're interested in learning more about this work, as well as our group's long-term research on Magellanic penguins, you can visit the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels website, which is linked at that QR code there. And it is a research group that is interested in using wildlife as kind of canaries in the coal mine, as indicators of environmental change, so that we can best conserve, what this talk has been about, conserve wildlife and the people that live alongside them. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I just had a quick question about one of the last figures you showed with the human-carnivore interactions. I just was curious what happened in 2022, because it was much lower than the other years.
This plot?
Yes.
Yeah, that is a great question, and one of the reasons why I was kind of having the disclaimer that we have to take this with a grain of salt, because there could have been something in the environment that happened in 2022. Maybe it was a very wet year, or there was some other climate-related context that meant there was low conflict, but it could also be some totally unrelated reason of why people were less likely to report these issues that year. Which I'm not really sure about. So I hope that I'll have answers for you in the future, but I'm not sure right now.
Hi. Question about the collars. How is it that after they wake up that they tolerate the collars, and that other their peers don't try to get the collars off or whatever?
Yeah, that is an astute point. In terms of how the individual that has the collar on tolerates it, our research group takes the welfare of these animals very seriously, especially because, for example, African wild dogs are very endangered. And so there are kind of limits to how heavy a collar can be in relation to an animal's body weight, and we try to stay well below those limits. And from our observations, there have been no negative impacts of the collars on the animals that we study. But especially with these little loggers that we kind of tagged on to the collars, we had a lot of problems our first year with specifically lion cubs being very curious, and immediately after, especially if it was a female woke up, just going over and gnawing at it and breaking it. So that is an issue.
I've seen these collars on rhinoceros, and they outgrow them.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of work to make sure that they're taken off and resized, and a lot of times they're not.
Yeah, so with the carnivores that we collar, we are very kind of, to do with that welfare aspect, we're very strict about the kind of specifications of which individuals we choose to collar. So we don't choose individuals under a certain age. They have to be old enough that they're done growing, because of exactly the issue that you mentioned. I think in other animals too, that I feel like that's often the context when harm from collars happens, is when they're placed on individuals that are too young. So we don't place them on individuals that are too young, or even on adults that have young cubs or something. It's really only fully grown individuals without any young that we would choose to collar.
Thank you so much for your presentation, very informative. Question, you gave 4 solutions at the end of the presentation of what can be done. How much is being implicated in that in Botswana? That's the area you're in, right?
Yes.
And then to your knowledge, in the rest of Africa, in the park system there?
That's a great question. I can really only speak to Botswana.
Thank you.
From what I know, it's being definitely the knowing the context of climate change and how it can impact, I think mainly through the lens of human-wildlife conflict, but also other aspects of animal behavior. There have been sections integrated into annual reports from these wildlife management agencies that are specifically focused around this issue of climate change. For example, my doctoral advisor is about to be a part of a symposium collaborating with the local government in Botswana about that issue of the intersection between climate change and human-wildlife conflict. So I know that it's an issue that the government is aware of, but I think that the stage of kind of designing climate-targeted management practices and kind of implementing them on the ground is very early. I know that in other places and with other species, they've tried strategies like having implementing artificial water holes with varying success, or having mobile fences for livestock, so that as they're ranging, they can offer more protection, especially during droughts or heat waves and things like that. But it's kind of a nascent field, I would say, to my understanding. Yeah.
Hi. I noticed when you showed the graph for how different animals moved in, let's say, some of the wild dogs, and how they traveled to different areas a little bit farther. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of these animals have complex social structures, so whether it be a hierarchy, matriarchy. Did you notice that some of the individuals within these packs would move farther based on their individual placement within that social dynamic, and how that affected their movement as well as the resource?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the most part, because the wild dogs move as a unit, we to kind of minimize the effect of any collars that we're putting out on the animals, we'll only collar one individual in a pack. There have been a few instances where, to look at hunting dynamics and how they're kind of moving when they hunt, we've collared every individual in a pack, but it's pretty rare. But your question about individual variation is great. I hadn't thought about that so much in terms of, in terms of the kind of like analysis structure that I have, we do account for individual variation in our models. But yeah, I didn't think about it that much with the home range analysis, but doing this this analysis of looking at carnivore visits to settlements, I am noticing that a lot of the, looking at wild dogs being more likely to visit livestock areas during drought, it's like 1 or 2 individuals that's like really driving that whole pattern that I'm seeing. So yeah, I share your question, and and I'm interested to look into that more. But yeah, that's something that is also kind of, I think, an important field to consider that's not really often considered in conservation, is like all of this variation between individuals and how we can account for that. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi, so coming back to this set of graphs, does this kind of contradicts what you had commented on before, right? Where here are more reported villagers complaining about wildlife or conflict with these predators, but then the lions before moved away from the settlements and the wild dogs moved towards, and here they look kind of even, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. We're not sure yet. As I mentioned, we're kind of working through that analysis. We think that it might be to do with the fact that the lions that we have collared are mostly, so yeah, you can see here, I'm pretty sure, I could be making this up, but I'm pretty sure that the dark red color in the GPS locations of the carnivores is indicative of an area where there's livestock, and the orange dots are areas that are tourism. And for the wild dogs that we have collared, we have wild dogs on kind of both sides of that fence. But for the lions, we only have lions collared in this study who are in the tourism areas. So that's kind of what I think might be causing that unexpected result, is that the attractant for lions during droughts to settlements would be livestock, maybe more importantly than water. And we just don't have those data. But then that also contradicts, the observation that I opened and closed with, of like, we see these lions come into our camp and drink all the time. So I think the answer is that there's just there's a lot of things that influence how these animals are making decisions, and we don't always have all the information to be able to like explain what's going on, unfortunately.
Hi, thanks for the talk, and also just beautiful visuals throughout the presentation.
Thank you.
I did have a question. As you're expressing how these animals overlap more during a drought, do you also find more conflict between species during those overlap periods?
That's a good question, and also something that we don't really have the data to test. That's something, because right now really what we have for this long-term data set that's been going from 2011 to present is those GPS locations. It's been very recent. A postdoctoral researcher in my lab that's been kind of spearheading this project of putting these little accelerometers, they're called, on the collars to be able to disentangle these like really fine scale movements, and at both like a fine scale in terms of the behavior, what are they doing, and also at the time scale of, a GPS collar might only take a location once every 5 hours or something. So it's just without either having something that like this that takes really detailed data, or being in the field and watching them all the time, you just can't really get at that, because you would have to be really lucky to witness those kinds of interactions. But hopefully that's something that with the advances of these technologies we'll be able to look at better.
I have one stupid question and one not so
No
hopefully
stupid
stupid question. First of all, when you can put a little tracking device on a bee, why can't you put something that tiny on a lion? That's the stupid question. The second question is, are you guys collecting data on the the overall health of the animals? And so when they're being compressed into these areas during droughts, is there more disease transmission, or are you looking at that?
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. The first one, I think it's kind of a combination of things. One, is battery life is kind of one of the biggest constraints on what kind of loggers we can put on animals and how long they can stay on. That's the heaviest part of the collar, and weight is the constraint that we're really working with. And so I think that to record the kind of data that we want for as long as we would want, right now you kind of, on a lion, you need, with the collar options, with the technologies that are available, commonly you need like a big battery. And I think part of the reason that technology isn't being, because I know there's like, with the bee, I think there's like, it's like solar charged or something. And I think one of the reasons that isn't implemented across species is that just like, there's not a lot of great, to my understanding, a lot of great communication between all these different companies that are working on these technologies. And so, yeah, it baffles me too, why we aren't like adopting these advances faster across and able to apply the technology across species. We are looking at putting in, instead of a collar, having like a solar powered ear tag is like a new technology that's kind of, we're testing it to see if it works out. So we'll see. In terms of the second question, we have a new PhD student in our lab who just started, who's looking at exactly that, at how, it's very interesting work looking at how social structure influences disease transmission. So especially with the African wild dogs, seeing if the way that individuals within a pack or individuals between packs interact changes during droughts and heat waves, and if that has implications for disease transmission. So stay tuned.
What's your strategy for working with the local community to not view these apex predators as a threat?
Yeah, that is a loaded question.
Sorry.
No, I don't mean it like that. It's just, it's hard to answer, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, obviously coming into doing this work, I care really deeply about these animals and I want them to thrive and be like healthy. And also, I don't, we in America have already kind of extirpated all of our predators, and there's ethical questions with like going in and working with local communities and telling them like how they should be treating these carnivores. So I think, it starts more, rather than like a place of telling people what they should be valuing or what they should be doing. It starts with like education. There's the research group that I work with has an arm called Coaching Conservation and another like Coexistence arm. One of the Coaching Conservation program, they work with local school children to teach about environmental themes through sports. So they'll do soccer and like have a week where they're pretending that they're wild dogs in a pack and they have to like help each other. And then the Coexistence group, it has a team that lives with a local community to implement livestock protection strategies and things like that. So I think it's really, about like educating people, things that they might not know about the importance of these species. And, for example, like if you kill this wild dog that killed your cattle, another pack's just gonna come right in. But then also like be listening and hearing people's perspectives and trying to come up with solutions that benefit both wildlife and people.
We can do one or two more.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you again for the presentation. It was excellent, very in-depth. I'm a little apprehensive based on your answer to the last question, but Botswana is very, very far away. I was curious, how can we apply the lessons that you're learning about how to shape policy to promote this coexistence in how we evaluate policy closer to home, both nationally and within New York State? As a scientist, how would you recommend that we approach sort of evaluating how we can shape our laws to better live in coexistence with these animals?
You mean kind of maybe wolves or like other carnivores that we have locally
Yeah, like
in the States?
wildcats or wolves.
Yeah, I think that I don't know, that is not, there are lots of people who that's their very specific niche of expertise, and it is not mine. So I think that my answer is probably similar in that it's really just listening, and I think there's a term called helicopter science, which is more applied to people Westerners working internationally, but can also happen at a local scale of researchers taking the approach of being at their university and thinking about what questions they think are important to answer in order to conserve these species, and then going to a local community and extracting a bunch of information about how they feel about wildlife and how they interact with wildlife, and then going back to their university and publishing a paper. And I think that the most important thing is at the scale of just approaching it from a perspective of involving local people from the beginning of a research process, having the people who actually are living with these animals be the ones to tell you what they think is important to study or what they think might work to what they need to manage coexistence, and then kind of involving them throughout the research process and returning your results to the people that are living with these carnivores, which I think is something that is being done more, but is not at the level of the national or policy level that you're talking about. But I think that effective conservation solutions have to start at that scale and that level. Yeah.
We'll do one more.
How much progress, if any, do you think has been made in terms of poaching in Botswana?
Yeah, that is also not something that I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I think that, the area where we work is, at least the majority of our study area is largely used for tourism, the area that we're living and studying these animals. And then even on the other side of this fence where there's livestock and livelihoods that, might clash with carnivore conservation outcomes, it's still a really important area for tourism globally, right? So I think that there's a level of I don't know, there's, at least at the scale of our field site, I don't know about that being a big issue. But I mean, I do know that they reintroduced, I'm pretty sure they reintroduced rhinos to our field site a while ago and then had to remove them because I think that poaching was a problem. But I don't really have a good answer. I apologize.
We'll do one last one.
Hi, I actually have two last questions that are short, easy questions. What is the rate of attrition with the collars? And also, you said that you usually put one tracker per pack when you were looking at the migratory patterns. Mm-hmm. What's the average pack size for the wild dog?
Yeah, so for the first question, you mean how often is it recording their location, or how often do they break? How often do they break? Okay. I'm what kind of breaking do you mean? There's so many kinds. So with the lion collars, that has been a big issue for us the past few years, is that we've put out some collars that have stopped collecting data and things, maybe they've collected GPS data, but they haven't collected the acceleration data. So there are technical issues like that. There are also issues with, so the collar that you guys passed around, I don't know if you saw, but there's this cloth, kind of cotton piece that attaches the two halves. And that is there because often, at least in our work, we manually remove the collar, so we find the individual again and we take it off. But if they, kind of head out somewhere far away or something, we want to make sure that they do come off so this animal doesn't have to wear it, indefinitely. And so that those will degrade over the course of about 2 years, usually a year and a half. And we've also had problems with those not taking 2 years to degrade, but rather taking, a few months. So yes, there are issues with with those technologies, which is why, I don't know, another reason why kind of the advancement of these tracking technologies that would allow us to kind of have more reliable and less expensive trackers that we don't have to, that don't have kind of these issues is exciting. Yeah. Oh, sorry. It varies a lot. It's also been really interesting in that In recent years, in our study site, I mean, there's so much variation across Africa, so I can just speak to the wild dogs in our study site. I think that, like, historically, the average is, I know my advisor's listening. Am I going to say the wrong number? But I think it's somewhere around, like, 10 or 13 or something like that. They can get really big. They can get up to, like, high teens or, like, 20s. Or they can be really small, like 3 individuals. At our field site in recent years, there has been kind of a lot of packs, like a lot of small packs forming and then breaking up, and kind of a lot more of those dynamics happening than normal, and smaller pack sizes than normal, which is something that some of our collaborators are looking at to see if it's linked to climate impacts. So yeah, it can change.
Everyone, please give one more round of applause for Leigh. Thank you all for coming. Taking a look at our calendar, and please come again. Also, if anyone's interested, the bar is open downstairs until 10 p.m.